In lieu of a book purchase, we'd also ask that you consider a $5 donation to sustain our virtual programming. Whether you'd like to think of it as this week, this month, or this year's subscription to our programming, you can make donations at literatibookstore.com/donation. Otherwise, we simply thank you for your attendance this evening, or this morning, or this afternoon, depending on where in the world you are and when you may be joining us. And now allow me to introduce tonight's moderators. Susan Bryant's book, The Market Wonders, was a finalist for the National Poetry Series. The Kenyon Review calls it masterful at every turn. She is also the author of the poetry collections Pioneers in the Study of Motion and Utopia Minus, an Academy of American Poets notable book of 2011, both from Ashada Press. Bryant has received grants and awards from Atlantic Monthly, the MacDowell Colony, the Academy of American Poets, the Dorothy Sargent Rosenberg Memorial Fund, and the U.S.-Mexico Fund for Culture. She's a professor of creative writing and literature at the University of Arizona. Philip Meters has written numerous books, including Shrapnel Maps, Sand Opera, and The Sound of Listening. Awarded fellowships from the Guggenheim and Landon Foundations, and 3 Arab American Book Awards. He is professor of English and director of the Peace, Justice, and Human Rights program at John Carroll University. Tess Taylor is the author of poetry collections Works and Days and The Forage House. Her work has appeared in Atlantic Monthly, Boston Review, the Harvard Review, Literary Imagination, the Times Literary Supplement, Memorious, and the New Yorker. She was the 2010 through 2011 Amy Clampett resident and has received writing fellowships from Amherst College, the American Antiquarian Society, the Headland Center for the Arts, and the MacDowell Colony. She was recently a Distinguished Fulbright U.S. Scholar at the Seamus Haney Center at Queen's University in Belfast, and Anne Spencer Poet in Residence at Randolph College in Lynchburg, Virginia. Thank you, and please join me in welcoming our guests.
Thank you so much, Rose. Thank you, everyone at Literati Bookstore for joining us here this afternoon, evening, or morning, depending upon where you are. It's such a great pleasure to have a chance to read and chat with Philip Metris and Tess Taylor, 2 poets and thinkers whose work I admire so much. The way that we're going to let the event play out is we'll each start with a short reading from our most recent works, and then we'll open it up for a conversation. And we have a few questions that we're excited to ask one another as well. So without too much further ado, I'm going to start, and I'm going to start by reading some. I should be sharing a screen right now. Can y'all see that? Thank you. I'm going to be reading an excerpt from my most recent book. It's called Defacing the Monument. And the book was written out of work that I've been doing with graduate students from the University of Arizona in the US-Mexico borderlands, engaging in reciprocal research in relation to environmental and social justice issues. And one of our partners in this project, one of our community partners, is the Kino Border Initiative. They're a binational migrant aid and advocacy organization. They have a beautiful migrant aid center in Nogales, Mexico. The last section of what I'm going to read 3 short sections, and the last section actually takes place in one of their migrant aid shelters. So I wanted to let you know a little bit about them, and also let you know that if you buy the book, 50% of my royalties will go to support the Kino Border Initiative. And if you can't buy the book, you can go to their website and support them yourself. The word economic does not appear in the text of the Department of Homeland Security's webpage entitled Obtaining Asylum in the United States. It is not uttered into the court record. The word economic remains in my mouth at the back of the courtroom where I sit, scribbling on a legal pad, trying to trace a relation to the 7 men who stand before the judge, shackled at the wrist, waist, and ankle. The body is a condition, the nation another. I used to believe the document tethered the poem to the earth, to soil that one could taste, that could be nutrient to more than one. But a document can pull a nation out from under you. In the US District Court, Arizona District, shackles chimed like the rigging of a ship in harbor in the moments before a voyage. 7 men approach the bench. One by one, they speak directly into the microphone to become a name in a document, a few words in the record, and 1 syllable of consent. Do you understand the rights that you are giving up, the consequences of pleading guilty in the terms of your written plea agreement? Are you pleading guilty voluntarily and of your own free will? Are you a citizen of the United States? On or about March 17th, 2017, did you enter the United States from Mexico near Nogales without coming through a designated port of entry? How do you plead to the charge of illegal entry? Do you understand the rights that you are giving up, the consequences of pleading guilty and the terms of your written plea agreement? Are you pleading guilty voluntarily and of your own free will? Are you a citizen of the United States? On or about March 18th, 2017, did you enter the United States from Mexico near Lukeville without coming through a designated port of entry? How do you plead to the charge of illegal entry? Do you understand the rights that you are giving up, the consequences of pleading guilty and the terms of your written plea agreement? Are you pleading guilty voluntarily and of your own free will? Are you a citizen of the United States? On or about March 14th, 2017, did you enter the United States from Mexico near Sassabee without coming through a designated port of entry? How do you plead to the charge of illegal entry? In 2005, Operation Streamline began the prosecution of unauthorized migrants, offers sending them to prison prior to deportation. Each migrant leaves the proceedings with a criminal record. In this sense, the process is documentary. Immigration rights advocates have called the proceedings assembly line justice because as many as 75 migrants might be brought before a judge in a single day, plead guilty to the felony offense of unauthorized entry or re-entry into the United States to serve jail time or face jail time should they be caught again. Proponents call the process a deterrent, despite evidence that most of those caught will try to cross again. Many have family in the United States and have lived here for years prior to deportation. Others flee violence or death threats. Others flee desperate economic conditions. The threat of criminal prosecution and imprisonment often compels those attempting to cross to do so in remote and dangerous terrain, increasing the risk of death and suffering, allowing our immigration policy to turn the desert into a weapon. However, it is undeniable that the proceedings are successful in their goal. They turn the migrants into criminals. Despite the consultations with lawyers and the migrants meet for the first time briefly before the hearing, despite the headsets and court interpreters, despite the judge's sometimes detailed statements about the rights that they are giving up in order to accept the plea bargain, some migrants do not follow what is happening. Do you understand the consequences of pleading guilty? The judge asks. Yes, I am guilty, the migrant says. And when the judge asks the migrant why he does not understand the question, the indigenous migrant for whom Spanish is a second language explains, it's too fast. If a line is a dot that went for a walk, then a wall is a line that divides Nogales, Arizona from Nogales, Sonora. A deportee is a man who left his kids at a bus stop, was pulled over by the cops, could not produce a social security number, and was sent first to jail, then to Nogales, Sonora, to be handed his belongings in a large Ziploc bag from the Department of Homeland Security. A frame of words can determine what one sees. A man walks across the US-Mexico border along a partitioned walkway. A man walks across the US-Mexico border in a caged walkway. US officials escort a man across the US-Mexico border in a human cage. And if I refer to him as a father of 2, and if I refer to him as a man, and if I refer to him as a refugee, and if I refer to him as a migrant, and if I refer to him as undocumented, and if I refer to him as a defendant, and if I refer to him as illegal, and if I refer to him as a criminal. Metaphors make circles of our lives, a Venn diagram of contrast and resemblance. Who goes where? In the 5th floor apartment that serves as a migrant woman and children's shelter in Nogales, Sonora, an 18-year-old girl who wants to see her father, a woman from Central America who left under death threat, a mother who fled an abusive relationship and now needs to make more money to support her children and grandchildren, and an 80-year-old who wants to cross into Nogales, Arizona for the 8th time so she can sell paletas from a pushcart. A nun prods them into telling their stories to us, 4 women and 1 man visiting from a creative writing program at a state university just an hour north of them. The eldest woman stands, raising her hand as if testifying or praying. She says, when the first President Bush came into office, he tried to make life hard for migrants. But we rose up, she explains, and stopped him. She says as soon as she can, she will go back to the popsicle factory, to her boss. She tells us her boss's name and address, says her boss will give her a card to help her stay as soon as she can get back. And the woman who fled her country under death threat says, we want peace. Decades of US policies and interventions in Central America that favor business interests over the majority of the population, that export gang members and failed anti-gang policies must feel like a long, dirty war. Do you feel better when you tell us these stories? One of us asks, and the woman does not answer. She just keeps telling her story. We are teaching them to make earrings, the nun explains, as she brings us into another room and shows us beaded jewelry, row upon row, each piece a little memorial to every woman who has come through the shelter. What did the nun tell them about our presence or what we might be able to do for them? Were they told we could help? Were they told we could help before the end of their 2-week stay at the women's shelter, after which they would have to find their way north or back from where they came? Were they told some faulty equation of voice and change, some scrawl of hope like the flight of sparrows stalling and diving without knowing whose house they alight upon? And what did we think we could do? Every summer for the past 3, I've gone to Nogales, Mexico, with students from the University of Arizona's MFA program to witness and write about migration and environmental issues unique to Southern Arizona. And each summer, as we bear witness to conditions migrants face, we wonder, how can we amplify voices without turning other people's stories into commodities, without reaffirming the faulty myth of giving voice? We do not want to reduce the struggles of the migrants we meet to mere human interest stories. We know that writing will not be enough. The change necessary to improve the migrant women's lives feels utterly available and beyond any single transaction. We will work hard, the women tell us. Do you have bracelets? We eventually ask. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan. I'm just reminded of the real predicament of being a writer and, wanting to do something and not really knowing whether our words can do anything, actually. Which sort of reminds me about the poems I'm going to read right now from Shrapnel Maps, which is a book kind of thinking through the predicament of Palestine and Israel. It's the fruit of a lot of conversations, research, questions, family experience, and some travel. I thought I would begin with kind of a strange little poem, which I'm going to share with you on the screen. It's a redaction of Mark Twain's Innocents Abroad. Which is a travelogue that takes Twain all over the place, but in particular in the Middle East. Ark Inn. No one can assess that stuff that has deserted Michelle and say the prophecy has not been fulfilled. In a verse from the Bible, which I have quoted, that it says all of these kings, it is in my attention in the moment because it said there's a vastly different home. I can see easily enough that says I must obviously and faithfully unlearn a great many things I've sometimes concerning Palestine. I must begin a system of reduction, like my greats the spies, out of the promised land. It's everything in Palestine too large a scale. Some of my ideas were wild enough. The word Palestine always brought to my mind a vague suggestion of a country as large as the United States. I do not know why, but such is the case. I suppose it's because it's so large a history. I think I was a little surprised to find that Sultan of Turkey was a man of ordinary size. I must reduce my ideas of Palestine to reasonable shape. I wanted to work with this text, this 19th century travelogue, for a lot of reasons, but one of which was that it has a sort of infamous depiction of the land, which is sometimes called the Holy Land, sometimes called Canaan, sometimes called Israel, sometimes called Palestine, sometimes called Greater Syria. And one of the things that he does at the very beginning of this description is kind of what's on that page, which struck me with such force. That he was aware at the time that he had received all of these ideas about the place and wanted to figure out some way of avoiding the predicament of simply projecting that fantasy onto that land. And sadly, he did. And so one of the predicaments, I think, as a writer is that we're always aware, particularly when it concerns places that are saturated with narrative and with fantasy projections, that we are sort of involved and implicated in a kind of construction and erasure of lived realities and experiences. And I hope that in some way, the book that I wrote is trying to not only render visible the erasures, but also question the very prospects and problematics of what it means to depict any reality or any story. At the same time, to recognize the deep precarity and power of peoples and the narratives that they hold. And in this case, Palestinians and the narrative of the ongoing colonization of the place where they come from and identify with, at the same time as acknowledging the Jewish story of precarity, trauma, and survival. And to that end, I thought I would share an anecdote which has become a poem, and now I've sort of tried to make into a film with the idea that we want to do some kind of theatrical adaptation to engage with audiences. And that's of something that happened at my own university. And without saying more, I'll just share the poem films. Give me 1 second as I find it. Here it is. Okay. At the Catholic University, a speaker clicks through slide after slide of barbed wire, cattle chute checkpoints, and walls. His mantra? Occupation. What threatens the Christians, he concludes, is what threatens Palestinians. A woman stands up.
I wanted to let everyone know,
she says,
that this talk was full of spin.
I can't see her. She's behind me. I'm afraid to look back.
The truth is the opposite.
My heart goes out to her, standing in the heart of another country.
The reason for the wall was that people were being attacked,
she says,
by terrorists. And after all, the Arabs sold the land. It was too much trouble.
I shrink back in my seat.
And at a Catholic school. You should know what the church has done, especially during World War II.
Then a man gets up. I can't see him. He's behind me. I'm afraid to look back.
The Jews bought a tiny piece of land, but the rest was stolen.
My heart goes out to him, standing in the heart of another country.
But they did not buy everything, even if they buy Congress.
I shrink again. She says,
You have 14 Arab countries. Can't we have just one? They should take you in.
He says,
But this is our land. Why should we have to leave? Because Europe took it from us? That is why we fight.
What about peace? Someone mumbles. He says,
How can you negotiate over a pizza when one side continues to eat?
She says,
How can you negotiate over a pizza when one side is trying to stab you with knives?
It goes on like this for a long time. Years, decades, generations. I sit like a child at the table, watch parents grip utensils, spit words like shrapnel. I hate how I love them. Ashamed, I look down, unable to bury the hot metal.
So that's about all my time. Thanks very much.
Hi, everybody. I'm Tess Taylor, and really, really happy to be here in conversation with these two incredible thinkers. And I guess I'm also going to share screen. I'm going to be reading a little bit from a piece of documentary poetry, but it's a piece that has a premise of following the notebooks left by Dorothea Lange to drive all the places that she photographed in California in the 1930s and 40s, and to just write letters to her from the places she photographed. I use her journal. She was a note taker as well as a photographer. For those of you that don't know Lange, I just want to remind you really quickly who she is. This is this very famous photograph, Migrant Mother, that was taken in a labor camp in where pea pickers were picking in the 1930s, Nipomo, California. It's still a totally agricultural area. And Lange was funded partly by the Farm Security Administration in a sort of prototype of the New Deal, making photos that were bound for Washington to describe the hardships faced by Americans, especially those working agricultural jobs. And she advocated for better agricultural housing, but she was also really concerned with the lives of migrants. So this book kind of looks like this. There'll be notes from Lange and then photos. This is Imperial Valley, a place where still, people pick crops in the fields and water is diverted from the Colorado River into what's essentially a desert. And she went there in the 30s and 40s to photograph migrant laborers. It's still an area full of migrant laborers, many of whom are in search of sort of very provisional housing. It's one of the poorest areas in the United States and certainly in California. It was one of the hot spots for COVID because people drive in vans together for hours to these fields where they pick. And of interest, of course, is also that on those fields that she photographed in the 30s, there's also now an entire web of border security and a detention center that holds 782 people. Lange also photographed Japanese internment in a weird twist. She was hired by the Bureau of the War, some war bureau, to photograph people being removed from their homes and exiled to camps that they themselves had to build. And she was supposed to do it, I guess nobody had checked her resume, but she was supposed to do it in a way that made it look like nothing bad was happening for the government. And she wasn't able to do that and the government confiscated her photos. So she didn't actually even see these photographs that she'd made for years. I don't have them here, but I do have these photographs also. As part of this project, I traveled with other poets, one of whom had grown up in a migrant labor camp, Marcelo Hernandez Castillo, and also Bryn Saito, whose parents were interned in a camp, not Manzanar. But I wanted to read the section where we go, Bryn and I go to Manzanar, and just give you a sense. You're going to hear language that's really like her shots of her of the photos that she wants to take, and then you'll also hear me writing a letter to her from the present. For those that don't know, Manzanar is now a national monument, but it was a camp, an internment camp in the Eastern Sierra. It held 10,000 people for 4 years. And it's in a, arid part of the eastern part of California, high up in the mountains in the desert. Manzanar, 1942. I'm going to stop the share right now. Barrack toilets, college students, arrival, interior, music, church group singing, nursery school. Barrack 3, early morning, meal, 5 p.m., baseball game, choir practice, picnic tonight. Ideals of citizenship class, boys registering, pots and plants beautifully tended, Swiss chard onion, cucumber, snapdragon, sweet peas, whole radish, red, soybeans, carrots, Chinese cabbage, sugar beets, tomatoes. Fukuoka Franklin, 3 sons in Navy, all born New York. Hayano Keshi, chemist. Sam Hari, gardener, baby. Jerry Yokomizo, hybridizer. William Katsuki, landscape gardener. Peter Hozo, young scientist. Akahashi Ted, wholesale market, produce shipper. Yushika Ukita, 4 American-born children. Kizuma Nagai. Carl Yoneda, blank. Elaine Yoneda, blank. Hot. Troubled by sand, dust, and wind. Dear Dorothea, the town nearest Manzanar is still called Independence. One spangled desert night, we slept beside the Inyo County Courthouse and woke to mineral mountains, goldenrod, and rabbit brush. Burnished creosote rusts away for miles. White stones mark the barracks where people lived for years on end. I see my ghosts more clearly now, said Bryn. Overheard, the way my grandfather tells it, there were never enough beds. On Paiute land, this list: Amache, Topaz, Heart Mountain, Gila River, Postan, Manzanar, Tule Lake. The majority in assembly and war relocation centers were under 18 years of age. In their preschool, children napped on cardboard. Mesquite claws the sky, crickets scatter. In one drained pond, a lizard runs. Green moons on a vast sky, the now bitter pears of the old orchard ripen. At the soul consoling tower, cranes rattle in the wind. Cement roads shatter at the border where interpretation ends. I wanted to read a small bit from visiting that part of Imperial County. There's a whole sequence that's kind of long in the book about driving up and trying to find this detention center, which is clearly grown bigger and more camouflaged and further into the desert from its original location. More militarized, more strangely run. It's run by something called the Management Training Corporation, which is this bland name for this job, which is essentially running a prison type facility. And the people show up for work in this kind of blue jersey shirts and khaki pants. It's like if they left, you might think they worked at a golf course. So anyway, there's a whole section about going there and thinking about what it's like to be on that land that Lang photographed earlier. And here it is. And it's hard to excerpt. So there's all of these travels throughout the book to Nipomo, where she took that photograph. But I just want to sort of end here with a very short poem from the end of the book of being in that land in Imperial County and finding a place where I'm driving along the border and parking my car early in the morning and getting off and just walking along a riverbank. The new river meets the all-American canal. If in apricot dust you weave past white sage and climb over pickleweed, you'll pick out a path, some channel for motion, low and half hidden and soft between bushes. If you push in and head north in the morning, you might find one shoe, a helmet, a toothpaste tube, and riverbank footprints, dog, wildcat, deer, human. Some desert morning, light prickling bird song awake, you might startle a duck from the green river banks. Dark among willows, the sign says poison, no entrada, and in sagebrush your cell phone can't say whether you're in the US or Mexico. And in blue shade, under the overpass, many cliff swallows dart from clay homes. In chaparral beside the slow river, you might walk for a while as the road grows distant, might feel in the silence how you're just walking, might feel for a moment how it's just earth again. Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to talking to these people who I admire, and I love that you've spent some time today with us.
Thanks, Tess.
That was beautiful.
Yeah.
I mean, that was amazing to hear your work, and the film, Philip, just, wow, just beautiful. Sometimes I'm dubious about this medium, like how do we transform it to these other spaces? And I thought that was really, really incredible.
Thanks. I'm still hesitant and scared about using such a thing. So this was the premiere, I suppose. So yeah. So should we entertain some of these questions and open it up as well?
Yeah, if you'll permit me, I have a question I think could kick it off, and that is, all of us are engaged in work that has an aspect of trying to depict issues related to social justice and power imbalances. And I guess I'm curious to what were some of the things that you learned in terms of learned as a writer, learned about the ethics of approaching these kind of situations over the course of writing your book?
Yeah, what a great question. Tess, do you want to start, or should I?
Sure. I mean, I started to think about Lang particularly because the visual landscape of the Bay Area has grown so ragged. We are living through an epidemic of shelterlessness here. And I grew up in the Bay Area. I live in the town I grew up in, which oddly Lang photographed in the 30s and 40s, as a kind of hopeful bedroom community dream that was at the end of this big migration that was happening. It was this ascension of people into the middle class and these sort of small Jimmy Stewart style bungalows of, like, remember in It's a Wonderful Life, they all get to move into like good housing, and they're like humble little cottages, but they're like decent and they have something lovely. And she photographed that with some tenderness. And she also photographed it with this realization that people were also being torn out of their homes, Japanese Americans from this same town, to be interned. So as I learned about her kind of eye for the paradox of the history of my town, I got really interested. But I also was interested because as I was looking at this epidemic of shelterlessness around the Bay Area, and like the many, many people living under pretty much every underpass and every freeway, I just thought I had no precedent for understanding how somebody could look at that without thinking about her, that she had made a project of doing something that I thought was successful in engaging people whose lives were in provisional state. And I just kind of wondered, like, what would she make of this moment? So in a certain way, I had a particular aid, which was using her as a lens to figure out something, to look through her, to see what she could teach me as I went. And as I went and described to people in all kinds of places, including housing shelters at the border, and including a camp for people without homes in the Bay Area, when I would talk about her and why I was doing this work, people responded really positively, that she was this kind of point of entry, that if I was doing this errand partly because of her, that they felt more relaxed about it. And people were really generous, and people knew who she was, and people felt that she had borne some ethical witness in the past, and that if I was trying to do some reporting, even in this strange form of poetry, people were so kind to me as I did this. But that was one thing that was really moving to me, to feel that this frame enabled us to have conversations. And but the other part of it that was really important to me was I developed a relationship with this one encampment in Berkeley, and I visited all year, and I arranged a lot of work around getting tarps delivered during the rainy season, and just like built a relationship with like these, it was kind of like a lot of people coming and going, but there were like 12 core guys that I got to know. And I just loved doing it. And it was not writing. It wasn't writing. It wasn't exactly even activism, like in some big capital A way. It was just like a piece of my life where I was building community and caring for people, and feeling like I was hearing part of what their story was, of what they would want or need in order to be housed, or what were some of the obstacles. But also it was just like relationship. And that part of it was really interesting, because I think it informs my writing, but it was mostly just like really, really good for me and good for my heart. So, some of this work is about being a writer, and some of this work is about being a human. And there's a Venn diagram there too, and I loved your Venn diagram. I think that there was like parts of this experience that were just for feeling more alive and connected in the world.
Thanks, Tess. By the way, I'm going to throw a name in the chat, and I wondered if you named that as a one of the internees at Manzanar, because Yoshiko Ikuta. Just look it up.
Yeah, I did.
Because I think I know this person, or at least the family, because this woman lived in Cleveland for much of her life afterwards, and
when I read this early on to friends of mine in this community here, they were like, "Oh yeah, the Yonedas, we love them. They were such activists for memory around this, So that was cool. Yeah, no, it's really interesting when people are like, "Yeah, the Yonedas."
And that to me is one of the interesting kind of, this is probably not the right use of the term, pronomial functions of documentary poetics. It sort of contains a history that's not really being told in quite this way, and that's just really interesting. It's like a capsule. When I think of Denise Levertov's poem, which is in some ways quite incomplete or raw, or maybe not as polished as her work, but she did this long poem called "Staying Alive" about the Berkeley anti-war movement in the 1960s and 70s. It has all of these like ephemera and documents in it that capture something of the rough texture of that movement. And that to me is something that's kind of magical, in the mix of the poetic, I don't know, sense of form. And so I think briefly to answer your question, that I want to hear what you say about it, Susan, is that I think that it continues to evolve my relationship to the work and how it's to do what it's meant to do, which is to say, I think I started the work out of a sense of almost ethical urgency, that there were things happening that were related to, to U.S. foreign policy and the ways in which we sort of offer $3 billion of aid, $3+ billion of aid, military aid to Israel without strings attached, without being part of any kind of process where Palestinian rights and where peace might be possible, where some kind of settlement might be possible. So I really did feel a sense of, after going there for my sister's wedding in 2003, that I had to figure out some way of, I think speaking is the wrong term, but of testifying to what I saw in the stories that I carried then, and the ones that I learned, and the ones that I felt like it couldn't be forgotten. And I don't know if I've done any of it justice. And I think in fact, there's, one pretty profound and somewhat excoriating critique of the book, for all the reasons that one might be critical of any sort of work that has representational energy. I felt that I couldn't not do it, and willing to take those lumps, I suppose. Yeah. How about you, Susan? Do you want to answer that question, or should we just, because that's like the center question of your book, was about positionality and
Yeah, I mean, I think the book was born out of these questions, and that the answer is the frustrating answer, that there's not one stance that you could take, or one attitude, or one aesthetic that you can adopt and say, this takes care of it, I'm ethical. That there's that there's, it'd be great if there were, check it off your box.
Certified organic label,
Yeah.
Certified ethical. Yeah.
Certified. I've been socially responsible in my poeming. And that there isn't, what is to reference what Tess was talking about, like, what is really amazing is that some of what I tried to do in this book was, as I grappled with these questions, which were particular to my positionality and the situation that I was in, I could draw upon the legacies and the work of other people. And I think we are at a moment where a lot of the work around us, if it's not straight up documentary, is engaged in a kind of witnessing and an activism and an involvement. And so we can look to the past, to models like Dorothea Lange. In my case, I looked to Muriel Rukeyser, but there are also so many contemporary writers who I think offer us different kinds of models. And I think we have to just, there's a kind of joy in accepting these questions as part of our project. And I think they enrich the projects that we're able to do, that there's so many projects that are both a project of perhaps representation, or gesturing towards representation and questioning the modes in which it's working. And there's a lot to be learned from that too. So that's exciting to me about this particular moment and these questions.
I'm so relieved to know that my vexation is actually natural and won't be allayed by any possibly correct procedure.
No stamp of approval.
I mean, that reminds me of this conversation. I was visiting a class and talking about the construction of this book, and sort of how I moved to excerpt some of her journals and how I gathered my own material. And that was a question that was really in people's mind. Are these ethical fragments? If things have to be excerpted, are they excerpted in a way that's ethical? And of course, that brings you into all of these really interesting questions about what is the part, what is the whole? Is there such a thing as a whole that could be seen, or is everything a fragment and therefore political? And that's kind of like one way to get around it rhetorically, to like point out that we live necessarily in this world of fragments. But the question, this hunger to like have done this in a way that didn't do harm, or to do it in a way that feels responsible, is like a real hunger. That's there. And Dorothea Lange, the moment that she's working in is really interesting because, seen from a certain lens, constructing the idea of the Great Depression per se can be critiqued as being like a white people's Great Depression. And, the entire way that aid was developed and delivered and even represented, literally people in Washington told her to photograph white people in order to kind of make the case that, that was something that was going to tug at the heartstrings of Americans and gather aid. And, she had a pretty diverse set of friends and comrades, and I think she was very alive to some of those dynamics. And but her time was not entirely ethical. The way that the documents were gathered, and there's even like a thing around Florence Owens Thompson and the questions around gathering the picture of Migrant Mother, is that, was she consulted properly? Was she represented properly? And I sort of think there's this kind of weird series of things that happens where the way in which the photograph moves is not entirely even in Lange's hands. And also it's just really interesting because there's this sort of tension around this story. And yet, does that mean that we like discard those examples, or do we look at them within context? And something I think about Lange, for instance, that people don't always remember, is that she had polio and moved very slowly. And so she would have had to, there was no quickly taking anyone's photograph. She just couldn't. She couldn't take photographs quickly. So she engaged people in these conversations. And then part of it is the story of how she was asked to gather information and for whom. So, all of those things change the frame a little bit. And then we still come back to the ethical question, which is like, what somehow like beyond this. It's something about the spirit of your heart and the spirit under which you undertake the work. And this is like not something that we can make a stamp for outside ourselves. That was meant to be a question, and I was that person who didn't ask a question. but maybe at least I provide an on-ramp for more conversation.
I think one of the things that it reminded me of is that the postmodern choice of the fragment was an attempt to resist the idea of totalizing narrative. That is to say that I'm speaking the whole truth about anything, right? But even the fragment, which comes to function metonymically, also stakes claims to something else. And then when we take any photograph, right, it becomes a floating kind of image or signifier to which all manner of narratives and stories become attached. So these are sort of predicaments that we can't get ourselves out of, right? I mean, I think that that's something that that I struggled with this book. Is I wanted to try to be kaleidoscopic, that is to say, sort of show lots of different perspectives as was posed in that certain poem, but also to not write a book that was simply like 50% Israeli and 50% Palestinian, because I think that there are power dynamics around this conflict that don't merit a kind of liberal 50-50 sort of thing and situation. And so, there's no math equation that can solve the question, really. But to know that there's this pressure placed on on any bit of language, on any part of a story, particularly that's attached to vulnerable populations, that we need to just take care with, and to figure out what our relationship is to that and how it's being employed in our work. And again, I think the easiest thing someone could say is like, well, I checked with so and so, and then there are situations where one can do that and say, okay, well, does this represent what you think? And but then there are situations like in Susan's case, like, how can you speak to these 10 people who are being deported and who you have notes about, and that's just not even possible, right? What do you think, Susan, about all this?
I think, it's not a one size, like, again, it's just not one size fits all solutions. And I think we do. So one thing I'll speak to absolutely personally, like, one thing that's been helpful for me to think about is, how do you gesture to the work's own incompleteness? I think just to remind your readers that this is the beginning, this is one person's perspective, is helpful in sort of disrupting. You had a great phrase for it before, the representational energy, or the totalizing energy of any one experience. And so again, like, it's not that there is one particular. I love, Phil, I love this question about the ethical fragment, and I love, Phil, that you sort of bring it back to an aesthetic. It was an aesthetic solution to a desire to not seem totalizing, right? But then, if you are fragmenting someone else's language, if you're juxtaposing it in certain ways, what's happening, right? And or how can that be tricky? And I just think I think it's individual cases and understanding that just the dynamics, like, I don't know, it's like we're always, our hands are on the work that we engage in. They have to be. So our perspectives, our biases, our shortfalls, if we're American, our own racism, our own misogyny, it's everywhere. How do you gesture to at least alerting your readers to be able to understand the incompleteness of any one point of view, I think is helpful. And that students are asking those questions is, in a sense, a positive thing. And it is definitely, questioning itself shouldn't be about creating an easy check off of things that you don't read because they might not do something. It's more, what do we learn from these processes? And what else do they gesture to? What are the other points of view that, if it's not, if a point of view isn't in my book, then what are the other books that would help fill in that point of view? And if I can gesture to them within the work, then that's successful, it seems like.
I think it's also trying to think of, like, what is this in service of? I think a great way is, like, obviously it needs to not just be in service of me. That's, like, really the first thing. But I think also that question of giving voice, like, is this book sort of going to change the world? No, that's not it either. But maybe it's in service of, like, illuminating the question in a way that people can hold the question. And I think illuminating the problem in a way that people can hold the problem, and translating it forward in some way so that maybe people who didn't hold the problem can hold the problem. I think it's also, not to make claims that you're speaking. I don't know. I think just to have tenderness for illuminating the problem is a really good place to be to set your sights on those goals. I think Yeats said, of quarrels with others, we make politics, and of quarrels with the self, we make poetry. And since we're thinking about poetry, it may be also that these provocations are about the quarrels that we discover with ourselves in the making.
Yeah, I wanted to add something, but I just wanted to say my appreciation to each of you for kind of working through these questions that we all share, you know, being interested in documentary poetics and trying to contribute to a poetics of justice, I suppose, you know. Yeah.
It looks like Literati is back.
It's true. It's true. I was just wanting to pop in right before, you know, our conversation continues, just to say that you all seem to have such a keen sense of like your role in portraying this kind of stuff with the eye of justice. And I was actually, I did have a question. I was wondering if I could sneak in there and ask you. It seems also that all three of you are very interested in like the borderland and borders and country, you know, not even, it doesn't have to be the US, obviously with the case of Philip. But I was just wondering if it is these borders in this kind of liminal space that interests you so much in the justice. Like, what is it that is making you so interested in these borderlands? You know, what is it that you're drawn to? I was just wondering if in these last few minutes we might talk about that.
Wow, where do we start?
Susan, you looked like you were going to talk first.
Yeah.
I was going to say, Phil, do you want to start?
Oh, you know, all I would say is that, you know, the border is this site of where the state declares itself, you know, the inside to some kind of outside. And, you know, thinking about those images that begin the film, there's this sense that that when an us is created, a them is therefore declared. And the border, you know, there's that wonderful book by Ansel Dua about the borderlands, La Frontera, and that it's also this site of, you know, commerce, intercourse, exchange, vitality, where labels and names are sort of fluid. And so there's this paradox that, you know, these borderlands exist everywhere, but they also become extremely militarized when there's this insistence on who's in and who's not in. There's been some recent books sort of about like thinking about the ways in which the very construction of these borders is part of a project of empire, and not just a project of state building, but of empire. And it's sort of spread actually, this kind of border building. So I would just say that, you know, I think I hope that one of the things that our books do is they open up that sort of precarious space to its possibility, and hopefully open them up literally to on some level at some point.
I think one of the sort of amazing things that the small segment that you shared with the poem and the film that you shared with us, Phil, is the way in which it suggests that the border is everywhere, in a metaphorical sense, and certainly for undocumented citizens, the border is everywhere in a literal sense. You know, the military investment in homeland security and border and customs, you know, means that sense of a militarized patrolling the boundaries of empire and asserting empire can happen anywhere in the U.S. So I think that is in part why, and you know, if we had a full panel that was talking about borders, you know, the Zoom screen would be filled. You know, there's so many writers, so many poets, but so many writers in general who are engaging these questions because they ripple through our lives no matter where we live.
And I love that thing, the border is everywhere, like the border is in your body. Like once you have to carry it with you, that's very clear that your experience of space, of living with borders, but also, one of the things I think about the way that, race is lived in America and also in the world is it's like the most profound imaginary that we live with every day. And similarly, borders have that same quality of being something which is like built and maintained and fortified, but also have this quality of being imaginary. And I'm remembering this poem that I wanted to look up by Adrienne Rich she says, there's enormity in a hair, enough to lead men not to share narrow confines of a sphere. But put an ocean or a fence between two opposite intents, a hair would span the difference. And it's just this like feeling that we live with something that has a possibility to govern us, but then also could be taken away. There's a sense of possibility there that's very profound and haunting.
Wow, thank you all. Were there any final thoughts that you wanted to kind of get to before we wrap up tonight? Or was there anyone that wanted to ask anything final?
I'm really grateful for being able to be here today. And Susan and Phil, this was just a joy.
Likewise. Thank you.
Yes. And will we have 1 second? Can we stop the recording and the thing and have a moment, just the three of us? I hope that's okay. And thank you everyone who's actually watching for being here and for thoughtful questions.